Is the Canon R6 Mark II worth the extra money over the EOS R? How do they compare in terms of specifications? How does the image quality differ between these two cameras? And what is the overall experience of using the Canon R6 Mark II versus the EOS R for shooting video? These are some of the questions that I'll be answering today. Let's roll the intro. What's up guys, I hope you're having an amazing day. I bought the Canon EOS R in December 2021, so 2.5-ish years ago, and the Canon R6 Mark II in June 2023, so 1 year ago. To answer the question right from the start, the Canon R6 Mark II is the better camera for shooting video. However, it also has some pretty big disadvantages which might actually lead some of you to the EOS R, beginning with the price. At the moment, the Canon R6 Mark II is selling for 2,400 euros. The EOS R, if you find it new, because Canon doesn't sell it anymore, it's about 1,200 euros, so it's half the price. And considering that for the price of the body of the R6 Mark II alone, which on its own can't do anything, you can get an EOS R with an adapter and an EF 24-70mm f2.8 lens and be ready to shoot basically for most scenarios. I would consider that a pretty big advantage for the EOS R. But of course, we're not gonna stop there. Some things which I like about the EOS R over the R6 Mark II are, for example, that the 1080p footage is better on the EOS R. And if I was to use these cameras, like I use them for 4K right now, and I'm also filming at the R6 Mark II at the moment, but if I ever was to need 1080p footage because I have an older computer or because I want even smaller file sizes, then I would actually trust the EOS R to do the job more than the R6 Mark II, because the 1080p footage from the EOS R is quite a bit better than that on the R6 Mark II. So much so that at the time when YouTubers were using EOS R back in 2019, 2020, most of them were filming in 1080p because it was full frame in that mode and upscaling it to 4K and uploading it to YouTube, and people wouldn't realize that it was actually originally 1080p footage. The Canon EOS R has another ace up its sleeve in form of a bigger and higher resolution back screen. I wish I could tell you the difference isn't that noticeable and that you get used to it with the R6 Mark II. Well, actually you do get used to it, but once you switch like back and forth, if you have both cameras between them, you immediately notice the difference and that the screen of the EOS R is just better. Another advantage for the EOS R is that it never overheats, whereas the R6 Mark II, if you shoot 4K 60 frames per second continuously, it starts overheating at about 40-ish minutes. I've actually never run into any overheating issues personally. I filmed weddings, I've filmed concerts with it, I have filmed theater shows with it, and basically any time that I need to continuously record for more than 5 minutes, I just use 25 frames per second, because in those situations you don't need 60 frames per second. If you record at 4K 24 frames per second, the R6 Mark II doesn't overheat at all. Now let's start to talk a little bit about things which I prefer more on the R6 Mark II. And the first one is, believe it or not, the ergonomics. To be honest, I do like the way both of these cameras feel in the hand, but I think the EOS R has, because it doesn't have IBIS either, has a little bit of a thinner body, and for photography that's perfect because it gives you a bit bigger grip. But for video, I find the R6 Mark II better because it is wider and it can rest, it has more surface to rest in your hands, which makes it easier to stabilize the footage. But both cameras are pretty good, and I wouldn't even consider that a deciding factor when choosing one over the other. The Canon R6 Mark II also wins when it comes to the button layout, in my opinion. Things like the photo to video switch on the left, the customizable button at the front, and the wheel at the back that I've set to control the ISO with are a huge upgrade in my opinion. I also find the top dial on the R6 Mark II a bit faster to access custom modes for video. As far as build quality goes, I think the EOS R is built a little bit better because the body of the EOS R feels stronger, and on the R6 Mark II it's a bit more plasticky, and some of the dials on the R6 Mark II also have a lot of wiggle room. It's not a huge difference, but it's there. Alright, now we've come to the big categories, starting with stabilization. The R6 Mark II has in-body image stabilization, which makes it perfect, especially for us hybrid shooters, because we, for most cases, don't need a gimbal. and the EOS R doesn't. I remember the first time that I was shooting video with the R6 Mark II when I got it last year, and just seeing it through the screen on the first project that I did, like quite immediately after I got the camera, how much camera movement I could introduce to my footage compared to what I was used to from the EOS R. To me, it was like unlocking a new superpower. That's the best way to put it. I've made some vlogging tests when I went outside and I was hand-holding both of these cameras with different lenses, so let's just see what the results were. Alright, so now I finally made it out of the forest with some serious damage from the mosquitoes, but in any case, let's go back to the studio and continue with the review. Resolution is another category where the R6 Mark II wins by a lot, because it can shoot 4K up to 60 frames per second with no crop, and it can even shoot 120 frames per second in 1080p as well as 180 frames per second in 1080p. The EOS R, on the other hand, can only do 1080p up to 60 frames per second, 120 frames per second at 720p, which is pretty bad. You also don't have autofocus on that frame rate, and it can only do 4K at 24 and 30 frames per second at a huge 1.7 times crop. By the way, the rolling shutter on the R6 Mark II is also very much improved compared to the EOS R. The R6 Mark II can only shoot on the IPB codec, which produces smaller file sizes, but it's also more difficult to edit on the other hand, and that's decisive when you have an older computer, whereas the EOS R can shoot both on IPB and All-I codecs. The latter produces much bigger file sizes, but it's also easier to edit. Another big difference is that the R6 Mark II can shoot 10-bit 422 in C-Log 3 internally, whereas the EOS R can only do 8-bit 420 in C-Log. And by the way, the R6 Mark II can only do 10-bit in C-Log 3. When you're shooting in Rec 709, then it's automatically 8-bit footage. Now we've come to another big topic, which Canon cameras are known to struggle with a little bit, the mirrorless cameras I mean, and that's dynamic range. I picked a high contrast scene and over and underexposed both of these cameras while shooting at ISO 400 on the EOS R and ISO 800 on the R6 Mark II, which are the base ISOs respectively. The results from these tests weren't very clear because the cameras weren't all that different, but I did notice, however, that the R6 Mark II, when recovering the underexposed footage, it had a little less noise in the shadows, but it also recovered the highlights a little bit better, which in the way that I've used both of these cameras, I didn't expect that, especially the highlights. Before doing this test, I was always under the impression that the EOS R is better at retaining highlights, but we will dive a little bit deeper and we will see why I thought that. So to make sure that these results were consistent, I also did the same test, but this time I was behind the camera. I realized pretty soon that in order to make the waveforms match of the converted footage on both cameras, I would have to overexpose the EOS R footage by about 1.7 stops in Premiere. So I went ahead and overexposed the EOS R footage by about 1.6 stops. When I tried to apply the Canon conversion LUTs again, the footage, the waveforms still didn't match. So in order to see how much information both cameras were actually taking, I decided to leave the conversion LUTs completely out of the equation and only show you the waveforms of the log footage. And according to these waveforms, you can see that the R6 Mark II has preserved both the highlights and the shadows a bit better. I can tell by the waveforms how much of a difference that is, but you can clearly see that the highlights on the EOS R are already clipping and on the R6 Mark II they aren't. Another big difference between these two cameras is the autofocusing system. The Canon R6 Mark II has a much capable autofocusing system, and it can detect different subjects like people, cars, aircrafts and animals. It can also pick up these subjects from further away than the EOS R, and it sticks to them better as well. And it also has a detect only mode, which I really like, and basically what it does is that it only focuses on a subject when it sees it, and when that subject leaves the frame, then the focus doesn't hunt back and forth for a different subject, but it stays there and waits until the subject can reappear in frame. And the EOS R's autofocusing system can only detect people's faces and eyes. However, in specific situations, the Canon R6 Mark II's autofocusing system is inferior to that of the EOS R. When it comes to tracking faces, the EOS R is more reliable, especially when you have also other subjects moving in the back. Like, let's say you are outdoors and the leaves of a tree are moving, which it happened to me once, and I was filming on the R6 Mark II. It was hunting back and forth from my eye, and it was switching and focusing at the moving trees, at the leaves. The EOS R would never do that. It always, when there is a face and there are eyes in frame, it's just very reliable and tracking those. So if you're planning to use these cameras for vlogging, for example, just know that on this aspect, the EOS R autofocusing system, which is older, it's funny enough more reliable. Another very important point where the R6 Mark II totally wins is that offering features that make it easier for you to get good results when shooting video. For example, two features that I use all the time which aren't on the EOS R are zebras and false color, and those are very useful tools to get the exposure right, and I use them all the time. But it also has a feature to pre-record up to 5 seconds before you press the record button. And I remember one time when I really needed that feature. It was in the winter and I wanted to film. I was seeing as the ice was melting from the roof of a building, and I wanted to film it falling down. I tried to do it without this feature on, and then I found myself just staying there and recording for about like 1 or 2 minutes and nothing was happening, so I was just filling up my memory card for no reason. So then I just remembered that I have this feature, and then I turned it on, and I was just pointing the camera at the subject and waiting there, and when I saw the ice start to melt down, then I just pressed record, and I captured 5 seconds prior to that, so I captured the whole scene basically. Another very important feature, this time hardware, is that this camera has dual card slots, the R6 Mark II, and the EOS R only has one, and it's obviously very important to have backups for those once-in-a-lifetime events like weddings. To conclude, as I said at the very beginning, the Canon R6 Mark II is the better camera for shooting video. So if you can afford it, I would say just go right ahead and buy it. On the other hand, if budget is tight, then I would suggest to focus on improving your storytelling as well as your lighting skills, because if you got those two down, the Canon EOS R will do the job just fine. Thank you very much for watching, guys. If you like this video, make sure to give it a thumbs up. If you have any personal experience with any of these cameras, please share it down below. The community will be very thankful. If you don't want to miss any of these videos in the future, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Until next time.